My civic leadership developed from an experience that I had when Gretchen and I were married and I started farming, and we went to Northfield to listen to two professors, one a religion professor and the other one a philosophy professor, and talk about Luther and his catechism. And they said this: if a farmer is pitching manure and a maid is scrubbing the floor, they're doing as great a work in the sight of God as a monk praying in the monastery. And that's just, I was started farming, and Gretchen, we had a hired man, and Gretchen was scrubbing the floor and all, and it fit. So I decided I'm going back to St. Olaf College and get my degree and take a political science courses and have a political science major.
When I was growing up, it was, I think, probably my father that placed in my head some visions of how, as a country, we ought to be functioning. Had strong views about the United States' role in the World War II. And I think he's the one that would have the most influence.
The accomplishment that really appeals to me, I'll give you two of them. One of them was just to be the person on the conservative side in the state Senate when I first started there to support the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Yeah, and on the conservative, Elmer Anderson was more moderate of the Republicans, and so I struggled with that because I knew the story of my grandfather who was shot in the leg in the Battle of Antietam because of his passion for eliminating slavery. And it just seemed that I was struggling with this part, whether I should go with the conservatives. And on the day when the bill came up, I stood up and said, there's no reason for me to vote for this because there's no African Americans in my Senate district. There's no need for economic reasons or anything that I could think of, but I'm going to vote for it for only one reason. It's the right thing to do.
Oh, what I'm most proud of, I think, is getting a fairly definitive set of laws dealing with international human rights and American foreign policy. I was chair of this subcommittee that had that as a topic. And so we were able to hold a lot of hearings and to develop some ideas which were then translated into law. So that's the way I look at the congressional service. Sometimes I think that my role as mayor was one of my more productive periods of public service, and being able to get some things done and developing some good working relationships and acquiring some really good staff. I'll make that part of my public service something that I really appreciate. I think overall my continued interest in children and in ways in which we can help families with their kids and looking for opportunities to close the gap. There are so many issues that surround children, and I think that's where my interest has been primarily.
The thing that I really feel good about is what we did at the end when I was governor. And that's really the biggest. When Roger Bowe and I came together, worked together, and we enacted legislation to solve the budget problems and into the future. If I hadn't done that, my reputation would not have been very good as a governor. What surprises me most in my years, I guess it is, if you could think of this, a child is born. The DNA of both your wife and you are in that child. That's you, as a part of you is in that child. The same thing is true when you come together with the various ideas in political, and the result of it is something is beautiful, and you take ownership as a child. And then you devote yourself to that, to the betterment of the child, realizing everyone is unique in itself. And so when Democrats and Republicans can come together in that way, so the DNA of the best DNA of both of them come together in the legislation.
The fact that I was actually able to make some things happen, I didn't have any pretensions when I first got elected, and I felt that public service was an important idea that I would try to fulfill, but I didn't have an agenda. But once I was in the different public positions, I found a lot of issues that I thought really compelled some attention, and that's where I spent my efforts.
Well, when I remember the first time I talked to Don Fraser, where he sat in the Senate chambers, and I was over on the other side. He was caucusing with the Liberals, and I was caucusing with the Conservatives, and he stood out for me because he was the only person there younger than me. He was 6 months younger, and so I talked with him. And here's what he said to me when I talked with him. He said, "I usually figure out where I stand, and then I figure out all the reasons to promote that." I rejected that at the time, but then I realized how important that is, what he said. Figure out where you stand, then meet with somebody else who doesn't stand that way, then interact and see if you can listen, and you might learn something from the other side. And then think how it fits with yours, and then deal with that in love. So those 3 words, listen, think, and love.
Well, I've gotten to know Al over the last few years, particularly because he shows up at our meetings on the achievement gap. He's been one of our regular attenders, and what I've found about Al is that he's very open. He's willing to listen to other people's point of view. He doesn't seem to be locked into any one position, but it's quite clear that he has a very strong interest in children, and I think that's the dominant impression that I have.
Think of Don as a very understanding person on international relations. He had a good understanding of that, and so when I was there, I would listen and watch and see how he operated, because, as you know, he's not a bombastic orator, but very thoughtful words that come from him. But outside of that, the great thing that he did was to invite me to come what it was, I think, the Democratic Educational Study Group. And I remember the first meeting I went to, some of the DFL said, "What are you doing here?" But then they changed it to the achievement gap, all that. But just that we work together. Here's the advice I give them. Answer, why are you running? And what's the purpose of government? And usually people come up with the word, serving. And I said, that isn't it. It's justice. When you look at not only the judicial branch, but the legislative branch and the executive branch with the regulations that provide justice for people.
Then getting into office itself is a challenge. Once you're in office, you have to kind of learn what's going on and what the current issues are. And out of that, then you may find the issues that are of great interest to you. And I think that running for office with a particular issue in mind doesn't always work. You have to kind of get into the office and get an appraisal of how people are looking at the problem you're thinking about and where you feel you can really make a difference.
What I like to leave with people, and especially if they ask me the question, would you run for office if you were doing it now? And I tell them yes. And they look at me, how can you say all that? And so I just share with them some of the things that I did, because I think it's never hopeless to bring peace, bring love, bring respect between people. When I was young, my interest in civic, that's me.
Dog's upstairs.
Hello?
Congratulations. You've been selected to receive a free cruise to the Bahamas.
Oh, can you imagine that? Congratulations. You have been selected for a free cruise to the Bahamas. You got a boat, not a horse.